Your new book,
Mhm.
Brett, is Scrolling Ourselves to Death, Reclaiming Life in a Digital Age. The book is deeply shaped by Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. Can I just ask right off the bat, how did Postman influence you personally?
Mhm.
And why
Yeah.
revisit his work now at this time?
Yeah. Yeah, Postman has been really influential on my intellectual trajectory since really undergrad college. I went to Wheaton College, and I was a communications studies major. And I actually had a professor who kind of became my favorite professor, mentor, and he had studied under Neil Postman
Okay.
in graduate school himself. So he was kind of like a Postman disciple of sorts. And so he instilled kind of the Postman approach to media. And it was because of him that I started reading all of Postman's books, Amusing Ourselves to Death, Technopoly, Building a Bridge to the 18th Century, and The Disappearance of Childhood, and several others. And I just really resonated with the ideas that I found in Postman, and especially just kind of the critical approach that he took to technology and media and thinking carefully about it. So that's kind of the background on me personally, and just loving Postman. And even when I pick up his books from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, today, they just still feel so fresh with timely insights. And so the idea behind our book, Scrolling Ourselves to Death, which I'm just a co-editor of, so it's not just a Brett McCracken book. I'm
Sure.
just I'm the editor, and then we have a number of really good contributors for each chapter. So we kind of assembled a dream team of the best kind of Christian thinkers about technology and media that we could find. But the idea was, Amusing Ourselves to Death has been a really influential book. 40 years later, it celebrates its 40th anniversary this year in 2025. So we were just thinking at the Gospel Coalition, like, how can we honor this book? How can we just kind of commemorate this book? And we talked about like doing a series of articles on our website. And then someone on our team just suggested, what if we did an actual book? What if we put together kind of um, a book that updates Amusing Ourselves to Death for the scrolling age, for the digital age, and takes kind of the best insights of Postman, kind of builds on his foundation and his method, and but focuses on how technology has changed dramatically in the 21st century. So that was kind of the idea. And of course, being the Gospel Coalition, we have a focus on theology and spirituality, which is something Postman didn't really talk too much about in Amusing Ourselves to Death. He did bring it up a little bit from time to time, but of course he was Jewish, not a Christian, and and so our book is more specifically geared towards Christians, church leaders, pastors, trying to get them to think carefully about this new technological world we're living in, the scrolling world. And just as Postman was warning about how the technologies in the 80s, namely television, were negatively impacting our thinking, our thought life, our discourse, the way we like talk about big ideas. We're sounding similar alarms in 2025, but with a particular focus on how technology is negatively forming us in ways that have significant implications for ministry and the gospel and evangelism and things like that. So that's kind of the idea of behind the book.
Is there any hope in this book that people will go back and read Postman?
We do mention here and there in the book, like it would be a really great kind of companion read if you have not read Amusing Ourselves to Death, to kind
Okay.
of read both side by side, or after, scrolling ourselves to death, go back and read Postman's book. Because it still remains, as I mentioned, just so insightful, so fresh, and really just an engaging read.
Okay.
Postman was not only a great thinker, but he was a great writer, a great communicator. So even I reread Amusing Ourselves to Death about a year ago as I was preparing to edit this book, and I was just like struck by how well, for lack of a better word, how amusing it was to read, because he's just you know, a good communicator,
Okay.
and very kind of curmudgeonly in the best sense. Um, he's a critic of culture. He's a media critic, and that kind of curmudgeonly critic comes through sometimes maybe a little bit extremely.
Yeah.
He comes down very hard on some things, um, but anyway, he's an enjoyable guy to read. So we definitely hope that people who pick up Scrolling Ourselves to Death, if they have not discovered Neil Postman, hopefully they'll be led to read a couple of his books.
Yeah. Okay. That's what it's been for me already. I mean, kind of a
Mm.
foray into
Oh, cool.
Postman's thinking and his writing.
That's great.
Why do you think Postman's kind of dystopian
Hmm.
leanings, especially his preference for Huxley over Orwell, why do you think that resonates so powerfully today?
Yeah, I mean the Huxley Orwell thing, which is how he opens Amusing Ourselves to Death. I think he was just spot on with that, right? And we all kind of recognize that when we're going about our everyday lives and we look at people in a crowded waiting room or an airport and like everyone is just looking down at their device, like just kind of scrolling. They're like addicted, they're hooked. And what are they scrolling through? It's like TikTok. It's funny videos and like things on Netflix. It's entertainment. And that was the Huxleyan vision. It was dystopia that was not kind of enforced in this militant top-down way. It was dystopia that we kind of opt into because we are so addicted to trivial amusements and we just kind of have to numb ourselves into forgetting about reality. And one way we do that is just kind of hook into the IV drip of constant media, constant scrolling. So I think he was right on, and in some ways very prophetic when he wrote that book in 1985. Because if it was true in the television era that we were kind of just like going the way of Huxley's Brave New World, like it's that much more true today when we're like, we literally have a hard time putting down our phone and not looking at our phone for like 30 minutes,
Yeah.
So yeah, I think he was right on with that.
Do you think, is there any reason he speaks so prophetically to Christians, even though he seems to identify as
Mm.
a Jew, maybe
Hmm.
even like a secular
Yeah.
Jew kind of?
Yeah, I think he was more of a secular Jew. I think he had a real appreciation for the sacred, and he talks about that
Okay.
from time to time in Amusing Ourselves to Death. Like he talks about like the Ten Commandments and kind of like like the holiness of God and how it was an affront to the holiness of God to kind of create these kind of trivial images and idols and even yeah just the word the the way that God wasn't presented visually but through the word that comes throughout his writing.
Okay.
Postman has a real preference for like the written word, and he calls it like the typographic mind versus kind of the visual.
Yeah. Am I
So I
right that
think,
you even
yeah.
thought at one point that that focus on the literal word maybe was
Hmm.
even a bit of a weakness?
I personally think he goes a little bit
A
overboard
little
with
too
that
far. Okay.
and kind of leaves no room for there to be something valuable in the visual communication. Television, I'm like a film critic
Okay.
by trade, so I obviously believe that there's beauty and truth that can be communicated through non-literary kind of non-typographic forms. Um, but I think generally he's right in pointing out that there's things that like typography and the written word can do and can
Okay.
do well that kind of an image-based discourse struggles to do. And I think we're seeing some of those effects in today's world, which is, a little bit more image-oriented, perhaps more
Sure.
visual. So, yeah, but back to the question of like why Christians resonate with Postman, I think he just has a sense of like the holiness of God, the importance of having a distinction between categories of things that are important, whatever, however we define that,
Yeah.
the just the important things of life and then the trivial kind of entertaining things of life as a separate category. And what his big critique in Amusing Ourselves to Death is that we've conflated all of it.
Okay.
That's like you have like a TV preacher on the same channel that you watch sports and like Sesame Street and everything. Like it's just it takes the holy, like the preaching of God's word should be a different experience
Yeah.
than watching, a soap opera on TV. But the media forms today just kind of conflate everything. And that's so much more true today with like our feeds.
Hmm.
Think about like your Twitter feed or your Facebook feed. It's like one thing after another thing after, and it's just all disconnected. It could be some horrific image of a plane crash,
Yeah.
and then the next thing you see is like some silly meme that's like a joke. And then the next thing you see is like celebrity gossip. And then the next thing is like a political assassination. It's just like everything, the important, the trivial, the serious, the unserious, and increasingly the real and the fake,
Yeah.
with deep fakes and AI, like it's all coming at us in an indiscriminate fashion. And there's a lot that's problematic about that. And Postman, was getting at a lot of those problems in amusing ourselves to death.
Think related to that, you highlight how entertainment, maybe this is kind of what you're saying, has replaced seriousness, uh,
Hmm.
and even in spiritual discourse.
Hmm.
What do you think some of the theological consequences are of that shift?
Oh man, there's a lot to say there because I think that question touches on a lot of our contemporary church outreach methods,
Okay.
things like the seeker sensitive movement and the kind of business approach to church where we look at people like consumers in the same way that, advertisers look at people as consumers. And it's all about how do we present the most enticing experience for them so that they'll, click on it or purchase the product, or in the case of a church, so that they'll come to church and stick in church.
Yeah.
And I think there's just a lot of problems with that. When you start to, it goes back to the conflating things that should not be conflated. When you turn the church, the gathering of God's people, to have a holy encounter with the living God in a reverent posture of worship, when you take that and turn it into what ostensibly is just another kind of entertainment experience, another
Mhm.
product that's not too different from a TV show on Netflix that someone might watch, or a podcast they might listen to or something. I think that it creates this like category creep where people start looking at the sacred and looking at God and church as just another thing that they can consume and kind of opt into or opt out of, depending on their mood. Just like, when I'm shopping for a new pair of jeans or t-shirt, like it's all about just like what I'm feeling, what fits me well right now in this season, what looks good on me. But should that be the way that we approach like a church?
Mhm.
Sadly, a lot of us do approach that. We talk about church shopping. That's like an actual term that we use and we've normalized in our culture. And that's a byproduct of this conflation of something holy and sacred. The church has now become more like a product for consumers. So I could go on and on about that, but I mean, I've written entire books. My book Uncomfortable was all about the
Okay.
consumer Christianity problem and how we've, all the things that go wrong when you start to look at church through that lens of consumer preference. Um, Things just don't work out well. So we,
And what
we don't
apart?
we
Oh, sorry.
yeah
Go ahead.
we just make it worse as pastors and church leaders when we
Mhm.
play into that. And it's hard. I sympathize with pastors because they recognize that a lot of people do look at church as a consumer. They do see themselves as um, a a consumer that needs to be won over. You know, like it's the onus is on the church to make the best pitch for
Yeah.
why I should come and why I should stay. And I get that that's a real pressure, and I feel bad that pastors and church leaders have to deal with that, but I don't think they're doing themselves any favors by just kind of indiscriminately like going with that and like,
Sure.
okay, we're gonna like we're going to do our best to serve you as the consumer. We're going to do our best to be seeker sensitive to make sure that we remove all friction points, any like possibility of you exiting. We're going to think carefully about that. Um, and yeah, I mean, of course, there's like things we need to consider. We don't want to make our churches unnecessarily off-putting, but it's not a good road to go down to start to like position your church in the same way that a brand positions a product,
Yeah.
where with like focus groups and like and like which colors are going to resonate with Gen Z most, those sorts of things.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think that's a good approach. So, and I think Postman would agree, and that's the sort of thing that he was getting at with his discussion of the kind of desacralizing, the trivializing of church and you know religious experience in the age of television.
Excuse me. Do you think the church, well, I guess, how does the church not play into, to
Hmm.
use this term, currency of attention?
Mm,
Is it,
yeah.
that's a tricky one that I was trying to think
Hmm.
about. I'm like, how
Hmm.
do we not become a
Yeah.
part of that?
Yeah.
Because I'm pastoring here.
Yeah.
I'm trying to
Yeah.
some degree get people's attention for Sunday
Totally.
mornings and throughout the
It's
week.
hard. I mean, again, I sympathize with pastors because the reality is we do live in a attention overloaded world where people's attention is ever more limited and they have to make choices all the time in terms of where to give their limited attention. And so, for better or worse, everyone is vying for a smaller and smaller segment of people's attention. And so the competition is fierce.
Yeah.
Um, so I think I would say you have to recognize that that is a reality. So capturing people's attention is something that you should think about as a church, but you shouldn't go about it in the same way with the same methods as advertisers do,
Yeah.
TikTokers do, social media influencers do. Like, we don't want to play by those rules, if that makes sense, because
Yep.
that's just it's gonna shrink what the church is to just another like thing that you click on or like
Yeah.
watch on YouTube. So I think there's ways that you can like consider the attention economy and like how do we like captivate people. Um, but what I say is like churches sometimes don't recognize like just the resources that they have inherently as a church, that just by nature of what the church is captivating for people's attention. Like, so I think churches that lean into their churchiness in a weird way and just kind of no apologies about the fact that this is a very different experience
Hmm.
from what you guys are experiencing Monday through Saturday, on your phones, on YouTube. Like, you come to church on a Sunday, you're going to get something radically different. You're going to get an encounter with the holy living God. You're going to get this weird countercultural experience of singing together with a crowd of people.
Yeah.
Like, that's a weird thing that we don't do anywhere else in culture.
Yep.
You're gonna get these like sacred liturgical moments, like taking the Lord's Supper and praying for one another.
Hmm.
And all of that is just, I think it's what the church has always done, right? But that's what's going to captivate people's attention because it's so different, right?
Yeah.
It's such a contrast to the flood of kind of trivial media that people are receiving in an
Hmm.
IV drip. So rather than the church trying to compete on that level, trying to be as gimmicky as TikTok is or whatever, like lean into how you are different from that and trust that the Holy Spirit will work in people to make that appealing to them, and increasingly when I talk to Gen Z, particularly the digital native generation who've grown up with their phones as this, ubiquitous thing, they are actually really appreciative of churches that kind of lean into just kind of the analog experience of like the embodied fellowship.
Yeah.
Just anecdotally, when I look around me at my church on Sunday morning, we have a lot of Gen Z people in our church. We're close to a university, a Christian university. And so we have like dozens of like 20 something kids. All of them are like taking notes with an actual pen and a
Oh yeah.
paper, which I think is interesting. It's
Yeah.
it's like the older people in that church are like on their phones, like, writing,
Hmm.
taking notes on their notes app. But the younger people have, I think, are choosing, they want church to be different. They want it to be
Yeah.
this like physical embodied experience where they don't have to look at their phone for at least 2 hours on a Sunday. Like it's kind of like this haven from digital exhaustion.
Yeah.
And that's a big point in scrolling ourselves to death that a number of contributors make in various chapters is like lean into the embodied kind of countercultural community that a church can be and trust that that is what kind of the refugees of the scrolling age are going to want. They actually want that.
Yeah.
They don't want to come to church and just look at more screens. I'm not knocking like song lyrics on screens. I think
Sure.
that's fine. We don't have to go back to hymn books necessarily, but even little things like don't encourage people to like take out their phones for any
Yeah.
reason during church. Maybe even if you're a pastor, like invite people at the beginning of the service, like, hey, for the next hour and a half, like we invite you, not mandatory, but like we invite you to just put your phone away. Don't look at it. Let this be a holy experience of embodied, unmediated experience.
Yeah.
And I think that even that small thing would give people permission to do that and also reframe it for those people this idea that like, oh, church is so different. It's meant to be a different experience than so much of life as we know it in the digital age.
Yeah. In some ways, I feel like the older generation is following the younger. Like, I mean,
Hmm.
I'm not Gen Z, but I had a computer in our classroom, internet, whatever, from kindergarten and on.
Yeah.
And then my parents followed that to some degree. Like I was connected, before they were. And so
Yeah.
then we're getting off of it sooner,
Hmm.
going
Hmm.
to analog
Totally.
things, and they're kind
Yeah.
of still a little farther behind
Yeah.
in a
Yeah.
way.
It's funny. Like my generation, like I'm a millennial and I, all of my millennial parent friends who have little kids like I do,
Yeah,
like we're all like, we don't want our kids to have devices. Like and we don't want them to have devices in their schools.
sure.
So a lot of schools for the longest time have seen it as like a selling point. Like we're like a tech enabled school. We have
Right.
iPads in every classroom, like that, as if that's like a selling point.
Yeah.
But like I think they're missing like the emerging demographic of parents who are going to be the ones, sending their kids to these schools. We don't want that. Like I
Yeah.
would be perfectly happy if my kid went through like kindergarten through at least eighth grade, having never touched an iPad or like, and it's not like they need to learn how to do it. It's so intuitive. Like
Yeah.
my kid by 18 months old, like knew how to swipe on a phone just by virtue of like
Yeah.
living in this day and age. Like they don't need, it's not like a life skill they need to learn
Hmm.
anymore. Anyway, I'm getting off topic, but like I think you're right. There's a generational thing where it's actually the younger generations that are starting to react the most strongly because we've experienced the ill effects the
Yeah.
most powerfully. And it's like the 50, 60-year olds who are like very like online now and spend all their time on Facebook.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah.
Yeah, it would be a selling point too if I saw like we're in daycare era or time
Hmm.
right now, but if it was like, hey, we have a real library with real books and
Oh
we're
my
using
gosh.
pencils, I'd be like,
And that would be a
we're
huge
in.
selling point. Like
Yeah.
if a school advertised like pencils and paper, like we're learning penmanship, we're
Yeah.
learning how to like, and we're out in nature a lot. Like that's also, I
Hmm.
think a big trend that I'm seeing with like parents is they really do want their kids to be outside more
Hmm.
and they recognize like kids like on devices in like indoor dark rooms is like not doing good things for the
Yeah.
kids like so anything that schools can do to get kids in nature, even churches, like I would love to see like churches just prioritize like, taking the youth group on like backpacking trips outdoors, giving the Sunday school classes like lots of like free play outside,
Hmm.
like because I think Christians of all people have language of talking about nature that's like this is God's creation, right? This
Yeah.
is His handiwork, and there's such um, developmental kind of spiritual formation power in it that we need to kind of lean into. And
Yeah.
that's something I've written about as well in previous books. And just in the digital age, the importance of physical reality in God's creation
Yeah.
is so, so
I'll
important.
have to find and read that one because,
Hmm.
sometimes I'm like, maybe it's just that I'm a bad dad, but the easiest discipling of my little toddlers is when
Hmm.
we're like at a farm or
Yeah.
outside and we're just like, who
Yeah.
made that?
Yeah.
Or
Totally.
look at how colorful that is. Or
Yeah.
I
And
mean, it's so easy outside.
kids are naturally curious too, so they love it.
Yeah.
They instinctively love that kind of exploring. And yeah, you're right. Like the conversation starter to get to God is like so easy to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned this word a few times. I wonder if you could expand on it a little, if there's anything to expand on. What does true embodiment look like for a local
Hmm.
church today?
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it's a real live conversation in like um, ecclesiology, right? Like with COVID, the pandemic, everyone had to go online and like do live stream church or like online church. And a lot of people have kept that as a part of the way that they do church. But um, I think that we need to probably like take a step back and now that we don't have to gather online, there's no pandemic that's forcing us to not be together in person. Is that something that is a viable alternative for
Hmm.
the embodied kind of physical gathering? I argue that it's not, and there's lots of opinions on this, so I'm not the final word, but I think that what the church is in its nature, what God kind of has in mind for his church, is a physical gathering of people in a local community who come together, at least weekly to worship shoulder to shoulder, kind of to be able to shake hands, side hug, all those things, because he created us to be physical people. Like he didn't just create us to be brains on sticks that process information.
Hmm.
Um, if he did, then downloading a sermon, listening to a sermon on my podcast, maybe that could be church. But he created us as physical people with legs and arms and, whole bodies. And I think that it matters that we take that whole body to be a church together. So it's not just our brains engaging with the liturgical kind of worship experience, but it's our bodies engaging. And what I love about church history and liturgical history, and I don't know what church tradition you're a part of, but like,
We're the Southern Baptists of Canada.
you're the Southern Baptists of Canada.
Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, the
So you
Southern
probably,
Baptists at some point they planted a bunch of
mhm.
churches or started planting in Canada, and then eventually we were like, oh, there's not really anything Southern about us,
Yeah, you're like the
or there's
northernmost
enough of us.
Southern
So then we
Baptist.
became our own entity.
Mm,
But essentially we were planted by the
okay.
SBC. Yeah. But sorry, go on.
So with the SBC, I mean, you probably don't have as much of this, but like Anglican kind of, high church, like there's a lot of movement in services. There's a lot of
Mhm.
like standing, sitting, kneeling, passing the peace, shaking hands, like, and Baptist, I grew up Southern Baptist. So, there's a good amount of that as well. Like stand for the reading of God's word.
Sure.
Like that's like that physical posture matters, right? And so, even like the shaking hands portion of a church service, which goes back to like the first century of the church, like it was this moment in every service where you would pass the peace, with kind of, they probably didn't shake hands in the ancient, Mediterranean world. They probably kissed and, greet
Sure.
one another with a kiss, that sort of thing. Um, And then, of course, there's the physical sacraments of the Lord's Supper and baptism and things like that. And all that to say, these are physical things, right? Like the marks of a church are physical things. Um, and so we just need to recognize that and stop trying to make it a viable option for people to like do church or like go to church in a disembodied virtual place. Like maybe for people who like are invalids or shut-ins, like, and they literally can't,
Mm.
it's nice to have that option so they can at least like have some mediated experience. But for everyone else, anyone who can, make it to a church on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night or whenever, um, that needs to be the priority because God created us with bodies and we bless one another when we are present, right?
Yeah.
It is such a blessing, like for me, just speaking personally, like to be in church on a Sunday morning and to like yesterday, like getting to like pray with like a 20 something guy and like put my hand on his shoulder and like prayed for him and getting prayed for myself by someone else and getting to hear the voices around me singing. Like that's an amazing experience. And you don't have that when you're experiencing church on YouTube or something. So I'll stop there because
Yeah.
I can probably go on and
Yeah.
on, you know, advocating for physical church, but it is a big emphasis in scrolling ourselves to death that we kind of hammer that point um, quite a lot.
I have to think of this experience in this kind of embodiment term at some point because I've never really understood why this is. But during COVID, our church, because we're in a bit of a rural place, probably we had more of this opportunity. We just went into the forest instead of going
Mm.
online.
Oh, I
And
love
we
that.
met
Yeah.
for like, I don't know, I feel like 15 months or something just
Mm-hmm.
around a fire
Mm.
through
I
winter,
bet I bet
through
that was
spring,
cold
through
at certain times of
summer.
year.
It was cold at times. And in
Mm-hmm.
that way, like there was a bit of, I don't know,
Mm-hmm.
almost filtering. Like there
Mm-hmm.
was a bit of suffering to go to church.
That's
But
cool.
just being
Yeah.
outside, being like in a
Yes.
circle, being around a fire, I don't know.
Oh,
Again, I
that's
need to
beautiful.
process what all
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
made it like this, but like it was the most meaningful church experience
Mm.
that everyone pretty unanimously that
Mm-hmm.
was there had ever
Mm.
participated in, to where when they opened the doors to the churches, nobody
Mm-hmm.
wanted to go back because
Oh, cool.
probably not so unlike, doing discipleship with kids outside. Like it was so
Yeah.
easy.
Yeah.
Church just felt easy and
Yeah. Right.
different and meaningful, and maybe this embodying piece.
All the like bells and whistles were stripped away and it
Yeah,
was
I mean,
like
I could
it
show
brought
up in
down
a
to its
flannel
essence.
and
Yeah.
yeah, and
Yeah.
people were willing to pray together in a way that
Yeah.
they're not when you're like
Yeah.
in, I don't know, in
Yeah,
pews.
that's interesting. We had a similar experience. We planted our church in January of 2021, so like
Okay.
right at the peak pandemic. But the building we were renting had an outdoor courtyard, and that's where we met, for the first year during the pandemic. So it was this weird kind of outdoor courtyard, and we were in the round kind of. But it was is similar to what you're describing, like with all the accoutrements and bells and whistles and like creature comforts of church just kind of like off the table.
Yeah.
There was a purity of experience where the people who came, like who joins a church plant in the middle of a
Yeah.
pandemic? Like you knew that the people who were showing up were like not really consumer Christians looking for like a
That was
polished
exactly what we observed, that
experience.
anyone
Yeah.
showing up wanted to be there.
They wanted to be there and they actually valued this kind of like stripped down approach. So I think there's lessons from the pandemic that we still should be processing as churches. Maybe we don't have to go back to all the like polished experience of like church being more than it needs to be. Maybe
Yeah.
there's something to the very stripped down kind of organic feel. It's almost similar to like the early church meeting in homes and kind
Yeah.
of meeting wherever they could find space. And in the age of the mega church and the kind of like big rock star kind of show experience, like I think the pandemic was a perhaps like a God ordained moment of clarity for the church to kind
Yeah.
of recognize what was really important. And yeah, anyway, we
Yeah,
could talk all day about the pandemic and lessons from that, but different conversation
for
related to this.
us,
But
our
mhm.
church grew significantly through the pandemic because of that
Hmm.
outside stuff. When we
Oh,
came
cool.
back in, we kept meeting in a circle. We incorporated food into every service because we were doing that in the
Oh, I
pandemic.
love it.
And
Like, did you have like,
eventually we had too many circles that we had to go back.
hmm
We just couldn't fit any. We had to go back to normal seating.
mm,
But the trajectory of that is now like people are sitting in the
mm,
foyer because and I feel like it's still an effect of
hmm
what happened in the
that's
pandemic.
so cool.
It just kind of simplified church
Hmm.
in a
Yeah,
way that we're still kind of living
that's
in
so
the wake
cool.
of. Yeah.
Yeah, praise God. That's awesome.
Patrick Miller calls our phones digital syringes, which I thought was
Mm-hmm.
a unique term. Do you think that's too extreme, not extreme
Hmm.
enough? Perfect kind of analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. That is very evocative, that
Yeah.
phrase. And I think he's right. I mean, it's more and more recognized even by secular people, the social science community, that digital devices, particularly social media, are as addictive as illegal substances. And like, so this, if we're putting age restrictions on alcohol, for example,
Mhm.
or cigarettes, gambling, you can't go into a casino and gamble if you're under a certain age, because all of these things have high probability of addiction. So that's why we protect children from it. And what Patrick is getting at is that it's more and more clear that the way that these devices work psychologically, the way that
Mhm.
they kind of tap into our desire for dopamine hits and whatnot, it works the same way as like a slot machine. You get addicted because there's this variable reward thing going on where you do the slot machine and you may get a jackpot or you may not. And it's the uncertainty of that that keeps you coming back. And he's not the first one to make this connection. He cites some of the other books that have been written about this, but he's making the point that like when you open your social media, let's say Instagram, it's the same thing, because what do you do when you open Instagram? You're like, did I get a like? Did I get a comment? Like,
Yeah.
what are the like dopamine hits that I can get right now in this like 30 seconds of checking Instagram? And I feel that. I mean, we all feel that. Like, it is this like cycle of like, there's pleasure that we get when we post something online and we want to see like, are people liking this? Are they not liking it? And it's unpredictable. That's the
Yeah.
thing. Like on social media, you can type something that you think is gonna like be super popular and like get and it like falls flat. And then you might like just throw up an opinion
Yeah.
and like it goes viral. And I think that's part of what's so addicting about this, because it's this experience of variable pleasure. Yeah, I think calling it a digital syringe is very accurate, because like we're all junkies now. Like we can't. And then the way you know that we're all addicts
Mhm.
is it's that whole image of like sit at a coffee shop or a bus station or an airport lounge, look around you. I guarantee that like 90% of the people who are just standing there or sitting there will be like looking at their device and scrolling. It's just what we do in the interstitial moments. It's what did we used to do 30 years ago when we were waiting in line at a store or in an airport? Like we would just sit there and think, or we would talk
Yeah.
with someone, or we would read a book or something. Like
Mhm.
now, we all do the same thing when we have those like 5 minute gaps in our day. We do the same thing. We just pull out our device, and there's no real purpose most of the time.
Yeah.
It's not like we have to tackle some task in that 5 minute gap. It's just we are addicted. And so, like, we fill every possible gap in our lives with
Mhm.
scrolling, 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 scrolling. And so that just shows that the digital syringe is working. Like the algorithm has us right where it wants us.
Yeah.
It's become irresistible. It's become something we just can't stop doing.
Excuse me. You know, you mentioned just waiting in line, just the way this happened. I read this book shortly after I read Mark Vergop's Waiting Isn't a Waste.
Mm-hmm.
And they paired really well
That's a
together.
good pairing. Yeah, I haven't thought
Yeah.
about that. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
I
So,
mean, waiting is a lost art in the digital
mhm.
age. Like, um, there's an Arcade Fire song from like 10 years ago that I love. It's called We Used to Wait.
Okay.
And it's like, and it was really a song about life in the digital age, but they used this metaphor of like, we used to wait for letters, like, do you remember those days? I don't know if
Yeah. Yeah. I
you,
mean, a little,
yeah.
I don't know when you were born. I was born
Mhm.
1984. So
Okay.
40
82.
right now.
Yeah.
82. Okay. So not too.
But like I wrote letters as a kid, like to
Sure.
cousins, friends, and like it was such a pleasurable thing to like wait and see what came in the mailbox, but it would
Hmm.
take like weeks, between correspondence.
Yeah.
And now we're so accustomed to like instant communication, and it's become this problem, right? Because you text someone and there's this expectation of like if they don't instantly respond, you're like, what do they not like what I said? Like, is our friendship over? Like, what's
Yeah.
happening? Why aren't you responding to my text? And that's just one of many ways that we've lost the value of waiting. And I think there's a connection too with the whole filling your gap moments in your
Hmm.
day, just with more content, more scrolling. Like, there's something really important, and I've actually been reading a lot about this for my next book that I'm writing right now. But there's a really important neurological thing called the default mode network of your brain, and it's the part of your brain that is activated when you're not doing anything else, when there's no other kind of outward task that you are conquering. So it's kind of like the daydreaming part of your brain, like when you're just sitting you know, somewhere and you're like looking around in kind of a state of reverie or like daydreaming. It's called the default mode network. And scientists have found that it's actually a really crucial part of your brain because that's where like your brain starts to like um, set the agenda for like deeper level processing of things. And so when we get rid of all that time, when we have no default mode network, we don't daydream anymore. We don't just kind of sit and think and contemplate anymore. There's a lot that is lost in terms of how our brain is functioning on a physical level. And so there's actual science behind this kind of general feeling that we have in today's world that we're all kind of worse thinkers.
Yeah.
We're not doing critical thinking well as a culture, and part of that is because we don't give our brains those gap moments to kind of synthesize and to kind of imagine and daydream. Those are actually really important for our overall mental health. And so filling all those gaps with scrolling is it's terrible for you for a lot of reasons, but that brain default mode network is just one of the reasons why it's really bad for you.
Would
So
you say boredom fits into that too?
absolutely,
I always
like
thought like creativity kind of comes out of the boring
creativity comes out of
moments.
boredom. Like I think there's a real value. There's a spirit. I would go so far as to say there boredom is a spiritual discipline. Like
Okay.
daydreaming is a spiritual discipline. And for Christians, like prayer is really connected to this, right? For the same reason we don't have any more time to daydream
Mhm.
um, or to be bored, it's the same reason why we don't have any time left to like pray and to like just kind of be quiet with the Lord for like extended periods of time.
Yeah.
Um, I wrote about this recently at the Gospel Coalition, but a practice that I have tried to institute in my own life is to go on kind of a phone-free walk in my neighborhood for at least like 30 minutes a day if I can. And that time is so precious to me because it gives me time to daydream, but it also importantly gives me time to pray. And so I'll often use those walks to just like have an extended time of like meandering prayer, right? Um, and it's just so refreshing to like actually have those kind of spacious moments in your life where it's like it's unrushed. Because as a dad of three kids, like as you can imagine, I don't have a lot of free time during my
Yeah.
day to just like sit and have like a long prayer session with God. So I try to like during my work day, I'll take like maybe 30 minutes of my lunch break and I'll just go on a walk and pray and think. As a writer, thinking, having time to think is so important. And so even like before I sit down to write an article or a chapter in a book, I'll often do this walk thing where I'll like just go on a walk to think and to kind of process my thoughts and to collect my thoughts. And it always makes the writing easier because I come to sit down at my computer and I have all sorts of thoughts already kind of percolating. Um, but that's what's lost, right? When we don't give ourselves that time and we're just kind of going from task to
Mhm.
task, from this email to this text message to this YouTube video to this podcast to this Google Doc, when it's just all media all the time,
Yeah.
you're never, there's a lot of output that you're doing, but you're not leaving any space for like processing. There's a lot of inputs and outputs. You're consuming a lot of media, and you're outputting a lot of emails and text messages and whatever content, but it's that middle space between inputs and outputs of processing that I think is so important, and it's increasingly a dying art form.
I was going to ask how you personally kind of guard your own spiritual life from digital
Hmm.
distraction, but there it is, at least
That's
an
that's
example of
that's a
that.
big way that I do it.
I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Uh, oh, sorry.
The only other thing that I'll say, because I think it can be a helpful idea for people to consider doing, is I try my best to not look at my phone for the first 30 minutes of every day.
Okay.
So I have my phone. It's not my alarm clock, so it's out of my bedroom. So it's not a like instant temptation when I wake up to like look at my phone. And I just have found that to be a really good centering
Mhm.
rhythm because I'm starting my day not on the terms of the internet and social media and push notifications. I'm starting my day doing physical things like having breakfast, making breakfast for my kids, sitting down with my physical Bible over breakfast and reading a little bit from it. Like, and then, usually after 30 minutes after I do my Bible reading, I'll look at my phone and do the whole like checking all my notifications thing. But that little tweak, which I instituted a couple years ago when I was writing my last book, The Wisdom Pyramid, I have found it to be so life-giving. And so between that habit and the unmediated, phone-free 30-minute walk, those are two things that I would just recommend to anyone to
Yeah,
try. Just if you can incorporate that somehow in your daily or weekly routine, I think it would be valuable.
I appreciate that. Those are both good ideas. Brett, I have so many more questions I would ask you, uh, but I don't want to keep you longer. I appreciate so much this book and your job co-editing it, all the chapters, your chapter two, especially chapter 11. Uh,
Mm,
yeah, the book is Strolling Ourselves to Death, Reclaiming Life in a Digital Age. It's available now or
it's
still to
available
come.
now. Oh, yeah,
Available
it's
everywhere
been
now.
came out in April, so it's
Oh,
available.
April.
Yeah.
Okay,
Hmm.
perfect. Well, I really
Yeah.
appreciate you doing
Yeah.
this
Thank
with
you,
me, Brett.
Riley. Yeah, that was a great conversation.